Good morning and welcome to More Tea Minister. My name is Ian. Today we are looking at a Japanese green oolong, and its name is, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Kanaya Sayamakaori Oolong. All of that will be in the box below. I do know that Kanaya is the location of the farm and Sayamakaori is the name of the cultivar of tea. That's something that I've noticed about Japanese tea producers and vendors. There's as much an emphasis on the location of the farm. I suppose that's the question of terroir, if we were thinking about wine, but there is also an emphasis on the cultivar. And very often, the same producer, the same farmer, let alone the same vendor, will be cultivating different tea cultivars on the same farm, just different fields. Which means that although Oolong is not a very prolific product in Japan, it's more widely available with more choice than you might think is the case, simply because so many individual farms and producers are producing different cultivars of tea to be turned into oolong, even if only on an experimental scale. Now, this tea is interesting because on the one hand, it needs to be treated with the same delicacy as a Japanese green tea. Some of you may be aware that Japanese green teas are very fussy, if we can use that word, in terms of the temperature of the water in which they're steeped, sometimes as low as 70 degrees centigrade or lower, and you have to be equally careful with the steeping times. That is to do with the nature of the cultivars, but it's also to do with the manner in which Japanese tea is produced. Japanese green tea is produced, I beg your pardon, processed in such a way that the leaves are often broken up, they're fragmented, and that means they steep very, very quickly. This tea is a little different. Although we're having to use a relatively low temperature, 80 degrees centigrade, at least for the first part of this, it's also the case that the leaves are largely intact. That means we don't need to use anything too specialized to strain the tea. One of the features of Japanese tea vessels, Kyushu being a sort of generic name, not just for the side handle versions, is they have very, very fine sieves within them to strain out the tea fragments. That isn't the case that we have here. So we are going to try, in hopefully a short video, to brew this tea in two ways. We're going to brew it in a Western style, and we're going to brew it in a Gongfu style as well. So we're going to get on with steeping the tea in the Western style so that it has the time that it needs. This tea is from Curious Tea, and I am following their Western style steeping times. The first point is they've recommended 80 degrees centigrade, and they're recommending the water, the tea brew for 2 to 3 minutes, and it's a ratio of 1 gram of tea for every 100 mils of water, which is fairly standard for a Western style. Just to give you a quick look at the tea leaves, I've got two different samples here. You can see they're a lovely dark green, they're quite intact. And we're going to take a sniff of them. And there's an interesting herbal note, but a slightly sweet savory note, which I often associate with Japanese green teas. So, pre-warmed teapot, which holds 160 mils. So we are putting in 1.6 grams, hence we only need a very small pot. Let's get 160 mils in. It's not quite filled, but very nearly. There we go. And we're going to give that 2 to 3 minutes. In the meantime, let's look at the other materials that we will need. I have the gaiwan in front of me, which we will need for this kind, for the Eastern style, the Gongfu steeping. I'll use the strainer for both. I have another dish with more of the tea here. This is 5 grams, which we'll be using for the Gongfu style. And maybe you can get a better picture of it in this bigger platter. We'll be using the jug for both kinds of brewing. And I've got my wastewater pot over here out of shot. so that once I've finished sampling the Western style, we can move on to the Gongfu. I, of course, have our strainer, which will be useful for both styles of tea, but will be essential for the Gongfu. You may remember I mentioned before that more delicate teas, those where you're really trying to control the duration of each steeping, you need to pour the tea out quickly. Otherwise, the few seconds difference between you starting to pour and you finishing emptying the vessel or the teapot, the tea can be overbrewed, or at least it's not representative of what you were looking for. So I'm just going to put these tea leaves in our pre-warmed gaiwan and see if we have a different smell. There is often a separate set of smelling notes on websites to do with tea that's touching a warm brewing vessel. You know, it's so sweet and savory at the same time that it's almost biscuity. I think it's the baked. I think the savory smell is making me think of something that's baked. The sweet smell is making me think of biscuits rather than, let's say, pastry. These leaves won't steep, they won't expand a great deal when they're steeping. So that's not a very good way of checking. I'm going to sniff the tea. I think it's still got a few seconds left before we can sample it, but if we have to, we'll jump ahead, because the last thing I want is for any viewers of this video to be thinking, when is he going to get on with it? So I think we'll make an initial pouring of the tea at this point, and we'll see what we have. I can always leave it for a few seconds longer while I test it. It's a very, very pale yellowy green color. I think it's possibly too pale for you to see, although maybe you can catch it just there. Forgive me, that's the kettle reboiling itself. So let's see what this is like. This has had about 2.5 minutes. Very savory on the nose. It reminds me of a slightly sweeter Japanese green tea. The kind of umami saline quality is toned down. And there's a sweetness which you won't often find. And I think that's what the oxidation has brought to the tea. Let's pour the dregs of this out, if I can use that word. And let's see what those extra 30 seconds or so have done to the tea. We'll empty the teapot at this point. It wouldn't be fair to try it when I know it's been overbrewed. Don't need to pour quite so carefully with the Western style. And maybe because there's more water or tea in the pot, or those extra few seconds, you probably can see that actually. It's a slightly darker greeny yellow color. So let's try sniffing. Yeah, it's much more like a Japanese green tea. It's not over steeped, so there's no kind of cooked spinach flavor, but definitely it's like a Japanese green tea without the astringency that I associate with a green tea, and it's not quite as savory as some Japanese green teas. Yes, it's a lot more refreshing than I find green teas, especially the Japanese ones, but I am horribly biased. Let's pour out that tea. We'll also move this teapot out of our way as well. So that leaves us ready to brew this tea Gongfu style. And the water is still at 80 degrees, and if it needs to be a little warmer, we can always manage that. So, 5 grams of tea, pre-warmed gaiwan, 100 mils of water for this first steeping. This is at 12 seconds. I was counting in my head there. That is really interesting. Normally, a Japanese green tea, there'd be a great deal of difficulty trying to sieve that out from trying to keep the leaves in a gaiwan, but that's worked out well. That first steeping, that biscuity, sweet and savory note is back. I'm going to keep the lid off so there isn't any excess heat. Let's try a tasting. Well, first, let's look at the color. This first steeping, about the same as the second, as the longest steeping on the Western style. A greeny yellow, quite a strong color. Biscuity, sweet and savory. But very rich. It is a high concentration of water, but that is very, very rich. I'm not saying it's got a thick mouthfeel, but it's the intensity of flavor is very rich. Let's try that again. That's really refreshing, very, very heartening. We're going to try for a slightly longer steeping now. And then, if I can test your patience far enough, what I might do is bump up the temperature 5 or 10 degrees, and we'll see where that gets us. So this is our second steeping, still at 100 degrees. This has had now 25 seconds. Glad I have the sieve on that. Not only was I spilling, but the leaves have come out more. Still plenty in the pot, thankfully. Let's see how that's come out. I would say it's the same intensity of color in terms of gold, greeny yellow. Let's try the smell. Much more of the savory notes has come out with a longer steeping. It's much more like a Japanese green tea in that respect. That second steeping, it's like a sweeter Japanese green tea. There's no astringency, there's no bitterness, just savory and sweet. And that's what oxidation, if you'll forgive me using slang, brings to the party. It does seem to tone down some of the grassy vegetal notes. One more. Let's pour it away, and we'll go with a third steeping. We're going to bump up the calories. We're going to bump up the temperature by 5 degrees, and let's see where that gets us. We will reduce the steeping time as well, because we really don't want to overcook this. And then, so, that's the good thing about this kettle. I can just adjust it in 5-degree increments. Just let it reboil. We'll bring this down to 20 seconds, maybe slightly less. And I'm not pouring the water directly onto the leaves, so that reduces the impact of the heat as well. This is 18 seconds. I chickened out. Let's see where that gets us. So this is warmer water at 18 seconds. See where this gets us. The color is still just as intense, so we've drawn more color out because of the heat. The smell, the vegetal qualities coming out. It's still not overcooked, but that extra heat has brought out the sort of vegetal notes that you get with green teas. I wouldn't want to make that any hotter, certainly. You would be in real danger of overcooking it. Yeah, that's pushing it towards green tea. And it's only the smoothness that makes me realize that it isn't actually a green tea. What I've done is I've opened the kettle to see if I can bring the water down, the temperature down, to see what this is like at a lower temperature. See if I can rediscover that sweetness, which was very, very appealing. So the kettle thinks it's still somewhere about 85. So what I might do is tip a bit into one of these so it can cool, and then we'll put that water into the gaiwan, and hopefully, on average, that will have cooled down. So to save us some time, I'm going to skip to the end here. I can say that I would recommend this tea if you like green oolongs. It's always interesting to be able to try a new one, especially one where you have to work for a living. You have to treat it with a fair bit of respect to get the best out of it. I can recommend it because even if this particular cultivar as an oolong isn't widely available, although I have seen at least 2 other producers, not vendors, producers using this cultivar for oolong, there are more and more Japanese green oolongs coming to the market with more and more cultivars being used. So availability is not a problem. Can I recommend this in terms of taste? I'm going to try for a third steeping. The temperature is about just below 80 according to my kettle. So let's see what that does. One last steeping for about 20 seconds. Hopefully it's become clear that what we have in the flavor profile is the typical umami savory notes of a Japanese green tea, but the edge has been taken off by the oxidizing into an oolong form. So if you like a slightly sweeter Japanese green tea, I would recommend this. If you have a slightly higher temperature and push it up to 90 and use low steeping times, you will have something that's much more akin to a green tea, only smoother. Let's take a look for one last steeping. That's probably the most intense color of the lot, which is interesting, given that's a later steeping and a lower temperature. Let me try one last sample. We're back to balancing the sweet and the savory. And the vegetal, actually, that's brought all 3 of them into sort of equal balance. So if you like green tea, especially Japanese green tea, I would recommend this. If you like to try something a little different from Japan, I would recommend this. If you like green oolongs, I would recommend this. So all in all, another hearty recommendation with a proviso that this particular cultivar may not always be easy to obtain. All of that said, it just remains for me to say happy steeping and to say God bless.